everyone, and many thanks for joining me today for my session, Online Audiences in Learner Writing, part of the Insights on Demand event. So I hope that you are enjoying this Cambridge event. So let's get started by looking at what we're going to cover in my session today. First of all, we're going to look at what we mean by audience when we're talking about writing, and in particular, writing in a second language. We'll then move on to look at the way in which computer-mediated communication has had an effect on the idea of writing for an audience. We'll then look at some typical online genres and some of the linguistic conventions that are associated with those genres. And then finally, we'll try and pull all this together and look at what the implications are of all of this when we're dealing with learners and teaching and hoping that they're learning writing skills in the classroom. So let's start by defining what exactly what we mean by audience and what effect this has on writing in the classroom. So Tricia Hedge says, "It is a sense of audience that facilitates communication." Now, what this means, in effect, is that if we think about the audience and we think about what the reader does and doesn't know about what we're going to write about, this hopefully will make our writing probably more coherent and clearer and easier to understand. So we can do this just in terms of the information that we're writing about, but we can also consider things like, are we using an appropriate genre in which to communicate the written message? So what will the reader's expectations be in terms of what kind of genre they would expect to get this information in? So these things help and facilitate communication. If we get that right, our text actually as writers will be easier to understand. So this is linked, if we go further back, this is linked to a notion of intertextuality. As Hyland notes here, this originates in Bachtin's view that language is dialogic, a conversation between reader and writer in an ongoing activity. Now, Bachtin's initial idea was in fact associated more with literary texts. So the conversation that he saw taking place, the dialogue, if you like, was between different literary texts in the way in which they might influence or perhaps inform each other. So to take an example of that, we could say that the Walt Disney cartoon, The Lion King, is influenced and informed by Shakespeare's Hamlet. So it's that kind of conversation. However, when we're talking about second language writing, the conversation that we're referring to is usually between the reader and the writer. So we can break down our understanding or our characterization of what audience is by using these two terms of Eade and Lunsford. So they talk about, first of all, an audience addressed. In other words, intended readers who actually exist. So this might mean an individual that someone is writing to. It could be an organization or a company of some kind, but the audience actually does exist in the real world. So an example of this would be an email that we send to a company because we want to request some information about a product or service. So we don't know all the people in the company, but we know that the company exists in the real world. So we are addressing an audience, the audience addressed. We can contrast this with the other term here, audience invoked. Now, this is something that a writer kind of imagines, that the person that they're writing to doesn't really exist. They're a kind of fiction, and that is implied in the rhetoric of the text. So an example of this would be, say, a discussion essay, which is not addressed to anyone in particular, but is perhaps aimed at an imaginary reader. And in writing that essay, we're trying to persuade the imaginary reader of our point of view. So we've looked at the beginning at how a sense of audience helps before a writer begins writing, in terms of planning and thinking about who the reader is and how much they know. But it can also play a part in the writing process. So as Hyland notes here, an important element of drafting and editing is considering one's audience, the ability to see the text through another's eyes and therefore anticipate where the message might be unclear. So we can bring this idea, this sort of concept of audience, into the writing process and use that to help guide the drafting and editing of text that learners are writing, getting them to think about their audience at that stage in the writing process, not only at the planning stage, but also when they're doing revisions. If I think back to about 25 years ago, often when I was doing writing lessons with learners, this idea of audience was something that I often had to invent for them and say something along the lines of, or give instructions, imagine you are writing to, and then get them to imagine who the reader might be. So often the audience was invented. An alternative back then also was for me, the teacher, to say to my learners, well, I want you to write the text for me, address it to me. So I would act as the audience. Or another possibility is that classmates could be used as readers. So they wrote for someone else in the class and there was an exchange of text of some kind. Or it was also possible to create kind of larger projects with the class. For example, working on a school magazine that would be published and read by other students in the school. Or I know of teachers who set up pen friend exchanges, often with learners in another country. So in the past, these were all ways of trying to make perhaps an imaginary audience more tangible and more real. These were strategies that teachers employed. Another way of developing learners' awareness back then was to provide reflection and discussion questions like this. What do I know about my topic? What does my reader actually know about it? What does my reader not know? What is my reader's attitude likely to be? So getting students to consider these questions was another way of developing audience awareness using a heuristic of this nature. However, that was 25 years ago. Since then, there's been the advent of computer-mediated communication. And as Hyland notes here, the ways we write, the genres we create, the authorial identities we assume, the forms of our finished products, and the ways we engage with readers have been transformed by new technologies. So this clearly has had a significant impact on second language writing, just in all sorts of ways. For example, word processing, the fact that students can now draft their writing and use computers and word processing programs to facilitate the drafting process. But the way in which computer-mediated communication is interesting is particularly in relation to the internet. And the fact that this has actually provided a real sense of audience. So once again, Hyland notes, teachers often want to use the internet to provide students with a wider audience, and online writing gives learners the experience of writing authentic texts for real purposes and readers. So in effect, what the internet, the advent of the internet, has meant is that the whole notion of audience has become more tangible. And often when we were asking students to write for an invoked audience, we can now actually make that audience real by means of getting them to write and post online. However, online audiences are very motivating because they do give this sense of purpose and they are real for learners, but they do come with some challenges. So what I've done here is to focus on 3 specific challenges which I want to look at in a little bit more detail. So first of all, I want to look at the unpredictable nature of an online audience. Then I'd like to look at the issue of messages being misinterpreted when they're posted online. And then finally, I'd like to look at different conventions associated with different genres that are posted online. Now, before we do that, I would like to look at a story. This is a real story. This happened, I think, in 2013. You may have read about this story. And it's a very good example of writing and posting online and what can go wrong. So Justine Sacco was or still is, I think, a public relations executive. At the time, she was working in New York, and she decided to have a holiday in South Africa, and I think that's because she originally was from South Africa. She flew from New York to London and then flew onwards to Cape Town in South Africa. While she was in London, she made a tweet, or she sent a tweet, and in that tweet there was an offensive comment about AIDS and race in South Africa. Now, in the time that it took her to fly from London to Cape Town, 12 hours, that tweet went viral. And thousands of people read it, and thousands of people were offended by it. So by the time she arrived at Cape Town Airport, 12 hours later, I think there were some very angry people there to greet her. The result of all of this was that Justine Sacco lost her job. She was fired from her agency, and she had to make a very, very public apology to the people of South Africa. Her excuse was that by sending that tweet, she was satirizing the kind of racism that she had been accused of. However, there were people who were a little bit skeptical about whether this was the case or not. So this is a very clear example. And Justine Sacco, obviously, English is her first language. She's not a second language user. But it shows how something that is posted online, a message that is posted online, can be misinterpreted and create problems. So this brings us to the first challenge that I mentioned before, audience unpredictability. So the audience that learners are writing for online is no longer imaginary. It is there, it exists. People will respond. However, it is far more difficult to gauge readers' knowledge and attitudes, particularly when we're posting online and the message may go from one culture to another, and there could be cultural norms that are very, very different, and we can't always anticipate how readers are going to react. Also, the audience that students are writing for has the potential to react, but we don't know how they're going to react. Are they going to react in a positive way or potentially in a negative way? And if it's in a negative way, obviously that's more difficult to manage. So messages that are posted online, in posts, tweets, blogs, etc., are very easily misinterpreted. Now, if we are to believe Justine Sacco's defense of her tweet, then that is a very clear example of how satire has not been understood, how it's been misinterpreted. So what this means is that learners need very good control over the coherence of anything that they're writing online. So the text needs to be coherent, it needs to make sense, the style needs to be appropriate, and learners also need to have a good awareness of the connotation of anything that they write. Then the third challenge is, as I mentioned before, genre conventions. So there is now a very wide range of written genres associated with computer-mediated communication, so things like emails, text messages, tweets, social media, posting, blogs, online discussions. And as these genres have developed, special language has developed, what Simpson and Walker called Technolect and David Crystal calls NetSpeak. So we've got three examples here: LOL, laugh out loud, or TMI, too much information, or ZZZ, I'm falling asleep, or possibly I'm getting bored. So all of these different genres have different conventions in terms of style, word count, layout, etc. And each convention has a linguistic implication of some kind. So to look at the kinds of linguistic implications that different genres can have, or the conventions in different genres can have, I'd like to just take one genre, social media posts, and look at what some of the linguistic implications are. Now, if you look online, there are in fact a lot of websites that offer free advice on how to write a social media post effectively. These websites are mostly directed at fluent speakers of English, and there's a whole range of different options. I chose one. It's called Social Media Today, and I read through some of their advice, and I've just selected 3 examples of the kind of advice that they offer. So, to connect with your audience on an emotional level, share success stories. A post you write on LinkedIn for senior level executives will read very different to a post you write on Facebook for new mums. You may choose to share your opinion or take a stand on something important to you. So what I'd like to do now is look at the linguistic implications of each piece of advice. So this first one, to connect with your audience on an emotional level, share success stories. So this assumes that you can use the present perfect in order to introduce the success story. I've done this, I've achieved that. And then beyond that, you would need to be able to use narrative tenses effectively in order to tell your story in an interesting way. Also, there is this phrase here, on an emotional level. Now, this suggests that the writer can use a good range of adjectives in order for the reader to have emotional engagement with the text. The second piece of advice, a post you write on LinkedIn for senior level executives, will read very different to a post you write on Facebook for new mums. So what this suggests is that you need a good control of a grammatical and lexical style, because obviously the post that you write for senior level executives is going to be of a maybe slightly more formal but certainly neutral style, whereas perhaps what you write for new mums is going to be slightly less formal, more personal, more engaging in that way. So students would need a good control of grammatical and lexical style, a good understanding of the different choices that they can and should make in order to write for those 2 different audiences. By the same token, at the same time, the kind of terminology and jargon that would be associated with senior level executives is going to be very, very different for that associated with mothers of newborn children. So obviously this suggests that you need good awareness of register for those 2 different contexts. And then the third example, you may choose to share your opinion or take a stand on something important to you. This suggests that you need a good range of expressions for giving opinions. So if you want to share your opinion, that might be slightly more tentative, whereas if you want to take a stand, you might need to be more forceful and direct. So this means that as a writer, you need to understand the strength of different ways of expressing opinions. Now, if you are going to be more tentative, that would then suggest that you need to be able to deploy hedging devices. In other words, you would need to be able to use a range of modal expressions in order to show that you're hedging and sharing your opinion slightly more gently. So again, this is looking at quite a range of language options in order to follow this particular advice. So if we try and bring all of this together, what does it tell us? Well, writing for an online audience, obviously it is more tangible, and it's going to give learners a greater sense of purpose, and that is surely going to be more motivating for them than just writing for this invoked audience, this imaginary audience. I think that sometimes there is an assumption that when you are writing for some kind of online, or when you're writing some kind of online text, that it's always going to be more conversational, a little bit more relaxed, less formal, and as a result, it's going to be more straightforward. But I think, as we've seen just by looking at those three examples, that if you really want to communicate effectively with an online audience and not be misinterpreted and not suggest an inappropriate connotation of some kind, it is quite a linguistically complex exercise. It's not straightforward. So therefore, I would say that writing for an online audience, while motivating learners, at the same time does put pressure on the range and accuracy of their written language. And this reality of the online audience significantly raises the stakes for learners. So, as teachers, what can we do about this? Well, I've got three suggestions, three things to consider. They're not going to answer everything, but if they don't help in some way, they might suggest something else to you in your context. So, one of the first things I would suggest is that we give learners exposure to a wide range of example text, so that this can help them understand the audience expectations of different online genres. Now, obviously, we would give students comprehension questions to ensure that they actually understand the content of the text that we're giving them. But at the same time, I think it would be interesting to add some extra questions that focus on these two aspects of online audience. So the first is to get students to consider the role of the writer. So what Ken Hylam calls authorial identity. So when we write, we usually write in a role. So for example, you might be writing in the role of being a boss to your employees. Or you might be in an academic setting, you might be writing as a subject matter expert to other experts. Or there might be something that you're interested in just as a private individual, and that you are writing in that role to share information. Or often you're just writing as a friend to another friend. But we do assume a role, and it would be interesting for students to consider what role the writer adopts in writing that text. The second point is we could also ask students to think about the nature and the extent of the audience that text has been written for. So does the writer think that this text is going to be read by a lot of people or just a few people? What kind of people are going to read this text? So these two extra questions on top of any comprehension questions would help learners develop awareness of audience, particularly an online audience. A second suggestion that I would make is to focus on different conventions associated with written genres that are used online. So, for example, with Technicolor, we would look at what abbreviations stand for. We would break down acronyms, look at the use of symbols. So, for example, what symbols you need to use when you tweet and retweet, these kinds of things. So make these very clear to learners, because often these can vary from one language and one culture to another. I think it's important to place particular emphasis on style and register in written language, get students to focus on that when you're looking at the text. So determining whether it's formal, informal, or indeed neutral, and what kind of register. Is there any kind of special technical language associated with the writing? Underline examples of those. Obviously, it's good to develop grammatical and lexical range, because as we've looked at the examples for the social media posts, often that came down to students actually having a range of expressions or vocabulary that they can choose from. However, rather than just giving students lists of grammar structures and lexical items, it's better to do this with clear and specific contexts. So we're looking at a range of contexts and therefore at the same time developing a range of grammatical structures and lexical items in relation to those contexts and not just in isolation. So just to give some, just a few examples of what we mean here. So if you are getting students to focus on a text which is a professional or academic, comes from a professional or academic discussion board, you might look at the neutral or semi-formal style of that text, and then you might look at the register of the specific area of knowledge. If it's a blog, you might focus on the fact that the language is slightly less formal, perhaps has a more conversational style. It might use you as an indefinite pronoun, and there could be some examples of rhetorical questions that aim to engage the reader. If it's a personal social media post, well then probably the style is going to be informal. There's likely to be idiomatic language. There might even be some abbreviations or ellipses in the writing. And then if it's a tweet, obviously we need to adhere to the character count of the tweet, and again looking at appropriate use of symbols for tweeting and retweeting. So they're just a few examples of some of the things that you can look at when you are focusing on the text and getting students to notice different linguistic features of those texts. Finally, the third suggestion I have are reflection and critical thinking tasks. So I've got two examples that we can look at. This first example could be given to students just before they are planning to post whatever text they've written online. And it gets them to think about who will be reading the text, when they'll be able to do that, how they might react or respond. And it sort of, I've included things like my friends, my family, my classmates, because sometimes the things that you write, if you think, oh, my family's going to read that, do I want them to read that? So the aim here is just to get students to stop and think about what the implications are of posting online, and they may at that point choose to make one or two final revisions. The second task is something that could be given to students once they have posted online and they are perhaps expecting replies to whatever they've written. So this gets them to think about how they're going to manage that process. Do they need to reply? How can they reply? How do you think the other person will react to that reply? And then also finally getting them to consider about whether they, do you want to have an online conversation which is ongoing, or do you want to find a way of actually just having one exchange and finishing the conversation? So again, just getting learners to think consciously about how they manage the response before they actually go ahead and do so. So we've got to the end of the session, and I'd just like to summarize the key points to wrap up. So we have talked about the idea of audience and how an awareness of audience can actually give communicative purpose to learners' writing. We looked at the fact that in the past 25 years or so, computer-mediated communication, and in particular the internet, has meant that there is now an authentic and very large audience for learner writing, that it's more tangible and more real. However, this, by the same token, does present some challenges. The audience that we're writing, or that learners are writing for, can be unpredictable. It's possible for their message to be misinterpreted. And there are actually now a lot of genre conventions that they need to adhere to. So teachers need to encourage learners to notice online genres and the language that they contain. And at the same time, I think, as we've seen in the final two reflection tasks, it does help if we can develop digital literacy skills with our learners. So these are the texts that I referred to in preparing this session. As you can see, Ken Hyland is kind of a central figure, and I recommend his work if you're interested in the background of second language writing. In particular, the final book, Second Language Writing, second edition, it came out only 2 years ago, and it is a very, very good overview of issues, both theoretical and practical, associated with second language writing. So, thank you very much for listening and joining me today, and I sincerely hope that you enjoy the rest of the Insights on Demand event.